A Navy officer vanished in 2011. What was found 12 years later shocked investigators. A decorated U.S. Navy officer boards his ship, the USS Hawthorne, for what should have been a routine tour. Days later, the vessel vanishes. No distress call, no survivors, just silence. When the wreck is finally found 2 miles beneath the Atlantic, investigators realize it wasn't an accident. The hull wasn't crushed by pressure, it was blown apart from the inside. The ship's black box? Gone. And the man who signed off the repairs before launch, Commander Ellis Grady, has disappeared without a trace. But here's where it gets darker. Evidence suggests the Hawthorne was part of a secret experiment, a project so classified that those who knew too much were never meant to return. Was Grady covering up a failed weapon test? Or did something far more dangerous survive beneath the waves? Because when a signal resurfaced years later, one chilling truth became clear: the ocean never really lets go. Norfolk, Virginia, 1998. A coastal military town where the scent of salt water mixes with jet fuel and pride. Every morning, the harbor comes alive with the metallic hum of engines, the clatter of boots, and the echo of voices calling orders down the docks. This was home to the USS Hawthorne, a Navy research vessel rarely mentioned outside classified reports, and the men who sailed her were handpicked, steady, disciplined, and trusted. Among them was Lieutenant Commander Mark Ellison, 38 years old, husband, father of 2, and a man who'd built his life around loyalty to his country, his crew, and the ocean. To his wife, Claire, he was the calm in every storm. To his commanding officers, he was the kind of sailor who did things by the book, never cutting corners, never questioning the chain of command. When he boarded the Hawthorne for a 3-week tour into the Atlantic, there was no reason to think it would be any different from the dozen deployments before it. The ship left port under perfect skies, watched by families lined along the railings. Claire remembered the sound of seagulls circling above as she waved goodbye, her children clutching her hands, not realizing they were seeing their father for the last time. The Hawthorne disappeared over the horizon, a gray silhouette swallowed by blue. No one at the base knew it yet, but that was the last confirmed sighting of the vessel or any of the 73 crew members aboard. When 3 days passed without the scheduled radio check, Command brushed it off as a minor communication delay. 5 days later, they called it a technical error. By the 7th day, silence had turned into suspicion. Families began calling the base, asking questions no one could answer. The Navy released a short statement, calm, rehearsed, emotionless, assuring that the Hawthorne was likely experiencing a navigational issue. But among the officers, whispers spread. The ship hadn't just lost contact. It had vanished from the radar entirely. No distress calls, no debris, no sign of struggle, just gone. Claire refused to believe it. She replayed his last words in her mind every night. "I'll be home soon, Claire. Just one more run." She waited by the phone, staring out at the ocean that had always brought him back. But days became weeks, and hope began to feel like betrayal. She started visiting the docks alone, standing by the same spot where she had waved him off, scanning the horizon for a ship that would never return. The community held vigils. News stations came and went. Experts debated theories: a storm that struck without warning, a collision with a rogue vessel, equipment failure. But nothing fit. The weather reports showed calm seas that week, and not a single SOS ping had been recorded. Behind the scenes, the Navy launched an internal review, but even that began to falter when key records were reported incomplete. It was as though the Hawthorne had sailed off the edge of the world. Then, 2 weeks later, fishermen 50 miles off the Carolinas found something strange tangled in their nets. A twisted piece of metal, barnacle-covered but unmistakably military-grade. The letters USS HAW were faint but visible under the corrosion. Within hours, the Navy arrived and took possession of the debris, sealing the site and ordering the fishermen to silence under threat of federal penalty. When the story leaked anyway, it set the country on edge. News anchors called it one of the most perplexing disappearances in modern naval history. Conspiracy forums came alive. Families demanded answers. The Navy promised an investigation. But to the families waiting in Norfolk, that word had begun to mean nothing. Claire watched as flags on the base flew at half-mast, though no one would admit the ship was gone. She kept her children away from the news, pretending their father was on an extended mission. But deep down, she knew. Something about the official tone, the way officers avoided eye contact, the way reports contradicted themselves, it didn't sound like loss. It sounded like a cover-up. And she wasn't wrong. Because buried within a classified log entry, marked for deletion the same week the Hawthorne vanished, was a single line, timestamped 12 hours before the ship's last known location. Maintenance override executed, external command approved. No one outside the Navy was ever meant to see that note. But one man eventually did. And when he followed where it led, the truth that surfaced would shake everything the Navy thought it could keep hidden beneath the waves. The investigation began quietly, almost too quietly, as if someone wanted it that way. The Navy called it a routine internal review, but behind that calm phrasing was chaos. Missing maintenance reports, corrupted black box data, and conflicting radar timestamps that shouldn't have been possible. Accidents for decades. Within a week, Polk ran a short column suggesting that the Navy was concealing the true purpose of the Hawthorne's voyage. The next morning, his office was broken into, his notes taken, and the article retracted from the newspaper's website without explanation. The families grew restless. Vigils turned into protests. The Navy tightened its grip, insisting that speculation was hurting the recovery mission. But recovery implied there was something left to recover, and the ocean wasn't giving anything back. Then, in early September, two divers working independently off Cape Hatteras stumbled upon a debris field, fragments of twisted hull metal, a torn patch of the American flag, and a shattered bulkhead door with burn marks that pointed inward, not outward. That single detail changed everything. Explosions caused by mechanical failure push out. Those triggered from within burn inward. When the divers reported it, federal agents arrived within hours. The site was cordoned off, and the divers were required to sign non-disclosure agreements before leaving the water. They complied, but one of them leaked photographs to an online forum used by maritime engineers. The images went viral before being taken down, and by the time the Navy issued a statement calling them misidentified debris, half the country had seen the scorch marks. The families demanded an independent inquiry. Claire stood at the front of the crowd that gathered outside the naval courthouse, holding a framed photo of Mark in uniform. Her face was calm, almost unnervingly so, as if she had already accepted that the truth would be worse than the loss itself. A week later, an anonymous envelope arrived at her doorstep. No return address, no handwriting, just a typed label with her name. Inside was a single USB drive. She plugged it in against her better judgment, and what appeared on the screen froze her breath. It was security footage, time-stamped the night before the Hawthorne's departure, showing a figure in uniform entering the restricted engine bay. The quality was grainy, the lighting dim, but something about the man's posture looked familiar. He moved with authority, not secrecy, scanning his ID badge without hesitation. He wasn't sneaking in. He was supposed to be there. That was the moment Claire realized the unthinkable. The danger hadn't come from outside the Navy. It had come from within, from someone her husband trusted. Someone who had been on that dock the morning the ship left port, shaking Mark's hand, wishing him safe travels, and smiling as the Hawthorne disappeared into the open sea. By the time the Navy admitted the Hawthorne was gone, the country had already made up its mind. This wasn't a storm. This wasn't a malfunction. This was something far worse. Official reports called it an unfortunate maritime disaster, but the tone of the press briefings sounded hollow, carefully crafted, every sentence polished to remove accountability. Behind closed doors, however, tension was mounting. Satellite scans finally picked up a wreck signature, 312 miles east of Charleston, South Carolina, a field of scattered debris lying 2 miles beneath the surface. When the first remotely operated vehicle descended, what it captured contradicted everything the Navy had claimed. The hull wasn't torn apart by pressure or collision. It was blown outward in sections, jagged, uneven, marked by fire. Certain areas looked surgically damaged, as if charges had been placed deliberately at weak points. What caught investigators off guard were the scorch patterns, small, circular burns near the propulsion chamber that matched shaped detonation charges, the kind not used in standard Navy operations. Whatever happened on board that ship wasn't an accident. It was a controlled event. Forensic engineers studying the footage noticed another strange detail. The ship's data relay unit, essentially its black box, was missing. Every naval vessel carried one, and they were designed to withstand pressure and heat. But in the wreck footage, the compartment where it was stored was pried open, empty. Whoever sabotaged the Hawthorne didn't just want the ship destroyed, they wanted its memory erased. Weeks turned into months. The media lost interest, moving on to fresher scandals. But for those who had lost someone aboard, the silence became unbearable. Then came the break that reopened everything. A cargo trawler out of Bermuda recovered a fragment of the ship's stern that had drifted far from the wreck site. Embedded in the metal was a twisted piece of steel bearing a faint serial number. It traced back to a part that should have been replaced during dry dock repairs 2 months before the voyage, a part signed off by one man, Commander Ellis Grady, the Hawthorne's operations supervisor and Mark Ellison's longtime mentor. Grady was the man in the footage from the USB. Claire recognized the posture the moment she replayed the video. The realization struck with cold precision. He hadn't been waving goodbye that morning. He'd been watching his plan sail away. At first, it seemed impossible. Grady was respected, decorated, the kind of officer everyone trusted. But the paper trail didn't lie. His approval signature appeared on multiple maintenance forms tied to that propulsion system, the same one investigators now believed was sabotaged. What no one could yet explain was why. There were whispers about unauthorized contracts, private defense testing, and military-grade prototypes smuggled onto Navy vessels without full approval. The Hawthorne was rumored to be carrying experimental hardware designed to reduce radar visibility, technology that could rewrite maritime defense. If it failed, or worse, if it was exposed, careers and corporations could collapse overnight. A sabotage framed as an accident would keep secrets buried, eliminate witnesses, and erase the experiment from record. Divers continued to recover fragments over the following weeks, pieces of the hull, sections of railing, even personal items that drifted far from the site. Among them was something small, almost insignificant, a gold ring, its band warped, its surface blackened by heat. Inside, still legible, was an engraving, M&C, 1989. Mark and Claire. That ring became the unofficial symbol of the case, the proof that even the deepest water couldn't hide what had been done. The Navy held a memorial, polished and dignified, but under the surface it was theater. Families sat through rehearsed condolences and ceremonial flags while questions piled higher than the folded uniforms being handed out. Claire didn't attend the reception afterward. She stood instead by the edge of the pier, watching the same horizon where she'd last seen the ship vanish. And in the quiet rhythm of the tide, she realized something chilling. The story wasn't over. Whoever orchestrated this had miscalculated. They might have buried the evidence under 2 miles of water, but they forgot about the one thing that couldn't be sunk. Someone who still cared enough to look. Because even as the official case files closed, sealed under national security, someone inside the Navy had already begun working off the record. One investigator, a former officer named Samuel Reeves, had started piecing together what the Navy had deliberately overlooked. He wasn't chasing closure. He was chasing a truth too heavy to surface all at once. And what he would find next would make the explosion aboard the Hawthorne look like only the beginning. Detectives began piecing together the timeline of that final day, retracing every known step Eleanor had taken, from the moment she left her apartment to the last ping from her phone. They learned she'd made an unexpected stop at a gas station 30 minutes off her usual route, a detail that baffled everyone who knew her meticulous routines. Surveillance footage showed her standing by her car, visibly tense, checking her phone repeatedly before driving off into the direction of the old quarry road, the same area where her vehicle would later be found. Investigators initially suspected she'd been lured there, possibly under the pretense of meeting someone she trusted. But what confounded them most was that there were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no drag marks, no evidence of another car's tire tracks near the site. It was as if she had simply stepped out of her vehicle and vanished into thin air. Search dogs followed her scent only halfway down the rocky slope before it abruptly stopped, as though she'd either been carried or had entered another vehicle waiting just out of camera range. For weeks, the investigation stalled, the town sinking into quiet fear, and online communities speculated endlessly, some blaming a secret affair, others insisting it was an abduction. Then, nearly 6 months later, new evidence surfaced when a local hiker found a discarded phone case tangled in dry brush a mile from the quarry. Inside was Eleanor's SIM card, still intact. Data recovery specialists managed to extract fragments of deleted messages, one of which read, "Don't come alone. You'll understand everything when you get here." The sender's number, however, was unregistered, bouncing through multiple proxy routes. Still, it gave detectives a lead, and a chilling realization that Eleanor had knowingly gone to meet someone that day. The deeper they dug, the more unsettling the picture became. Financial records showed that 2 weeks before her disappearance, Eleanor had transferred a large sum of money, nearly $15,000, to a private account belonging to a charity organization that, upon closer inspection, didn't exist. The name attached to it was eerily familiar. It belonged to a former colleague, someone no one had thought to question, someone who had left town shortly after Eleanor went missing, her quiet, unassuming coworker, Daniel Carr. Reeves began quietly, gathering what fragments he could without drawing attention, combing through maintenance logs, shipping manifests, and encrypted correspondence between defense contractors. What he uncovered was a labyrinth of missing parts, falsified approvals, and offshore transactions that all led back to one name: Commander Ellis Grady. But the deeper Reeves went, the more he realized that Grady wasn't just a participant. He was a gatekeeper, the final signature between the Navy and a private defense firm known only through shell accounts as Meridian Systems. Meridian had been contracted to test stealth-adaptive hull coatings, a classified project that could make entire fleets invisible to radar, but several reports indicated catastrophic instability during trials. The Hawthorne had been their unsanctioned experiment. When Reeves cross-referenced procurement orders, he discovered something stranger. The charges used on the ship's hull matched demolition signatures from a classified demolition exercise conducted 3 months before, one led by Grady himself. That meant the very tools used to sink the Hawthorne were logged as training materials, hidden in plain sight under routine drills. To confirm it, Reeves needed evidence beyond speculation, and that came unexpectedly when a naval technician reached out anonymously, claiming to have recovered a corrupted drive from a dismantled server at the Charleston base. The data was fragmented, but inside were fragments of shipboard communication logs from the day of the explosion. One line repeated across multiple entries. Test sequence initiated. Confirmation, Grady. It was damning, but it raised another question. If Grady triggered the sequence, how did the command reach the ship after it departed? The only explanation was remote access through the ship's encrypted relay network, which, according to Navy records, had been disabled pre-launch. Someone had reactivated it. Someone higher. Reeves's investigation soon drew unwanted attention. His access credentials were revoked, his reports flagged for security review, and within days, his apartment was searched under the guise of routine audit. He knew then that this was no longer about one man's betrayal. This was systemic. But fate, or maybe arrogance, handed him one final break. A retired naval contractor, who'd worked under Grady on several classified upgrades, revealed in a late-night meeting that Grady had been preparing a private vessel for extended offshore work weeks before the Hawthorne launch. That vessel, named the Kestrel, was quietly registered to a dummy corporation tied to Meridian. Its transponder had gone silent the same week the Hawthorne disappeared. Reeves forwarded everything to a journalist friend, encrypting the files before disappearing from official records himself. 2 months later, local fishermen reported a yacht drifting unmanned 30 miles off the Florida coast. It was the Kestrel. Inside, they found fuel still in the tanks, supplies stacked neatly, and in the cabin, a single sealed envelope addressed to the families of the Hawthorne crew. The letter inside bore Grady's signature, its contents written in the cold precision of a man who believed he'd done something necessary. He spoke of removing threats, of preserving national stability, and of sacrifices for the greater structure. But what made the letter chilling wasn't its justification. It was the final line, written in a calm, deliberate hand. You will never find the others. The ocean keeps secrets for those who serve it well. The letter sparked chaos within the Navy's closed ranks, and for the first time, whispers turned into open confrontation. Committees formed, statements were issued, but no one dared say aloud what was now becoming undeniable. The sinking of the Hawthorne was an internal act, and Ellis Grady had not been acting alone. Reeves's files, now leaked through underground journalists, painted a picture far more disturbing than revenge or corruption. This wasn't a rogue mission gone wrong. It was a cleanup, a deliberate purge to bury a failed experiment and silence those who had seen too much. Behind Meridian Systems was a web of interlocked corporations, each masking the other, each funneling millions into covert research designed to merge artificial intelligence with real-time naval control systems. The Hawthorne had been the prototype, its captain and crew unknowingly part of a live test for automated command override, a system meant to make human judgment obsolete. But the experiment malfunctioned, and according to the recovered fragments of data, it wasn't the AI that initiated the detonation sequence. It was overridden by a manual command from Grady's terminal. Investigators couldn't reconcile the contradiction. Why would a man who had everything to lose destroy his own project? The answer emerged from an old psychiatric evaluation buried in his personnel file. Grady had been diagnosed years earlier with what military psychologists called mission-dependent identity dissociation, a rare form of obsession where duty becomes indistinguishable from self-worth. For him, the Hawthorne wasn't just a ship. It was proof that he still had control over the chaos he'd built. When the system started responding unpredictably, transmitting false orders, he panicked, convinced that if he couldn't stop it, he had to erase it completely, and everyone tied to it. Yet there was more beneath the surface. Reeves discovered encrypted correspondence between Grady and a retired admiral who had vanished from public record after a defense scandal in 2012. The tone of the messages was almost paternal, laced with coded phrases about resetting the ledger and removing liabilities. This admiral, known internally as Only K, appeared to have directed the entire operation under the guise of a security test, with Grady as his enforcer. But K had since disappeared, his assets liquidated, his records scrubbed. Some believed he fled overseas. Others whispered that he was buried beneath the same sea that had swallowed the Hawthorne. The motive, when pieced together, was a blend of fear, power, and ideology. They weren't simply covering up failure. They believed they were protecting the nation from exposure, convinced that losing a few hundred lives was justified to prevent foreign powers from replicating their technology. Grady's letter wasn't an apology, it was a manifesto. Every line reeked of conviction, of someone who saw morality as a variable, not a boundary. Still, something didn't fit. Reeves couldn't shake the unease that Grady's disappearance had been too clean, too perfectly timed. When divers returned to the Kestrel's last coordinates weeks later, the wreck had vanished, and sonar scans showed only disturbed sediment, as though something large had descended and then risen again. For many, that was the end of it. But for Reeves, it was the beginning of a deeper truth, one that suggested the system Grady tried to destroy might not have died with him, and that someone, somewhere, had learned how to control it. Months passed before the official inquiry concluded, but when it did, it left the public with more questions than answers. The final report cited compromised experimental systems and critical procedural failures, carefully avoiding names, motives, or accountability. Commander Ellis Grady was officially declared deceased, his body lost at sea, though no remains were ever found. To the families, it was another insult dressed in ceremony, another attempt to sweep truth under layers of jargon and folded flags. Claire Ellison sat in the front row during the televised memorial, her face calm but hollow, the kind of stillness that only comes when grief and disbelief coexist. Behind the scenes, however, fragments of the suppressed investigation began leaking onto classified networks, and when one of those files reached Reeves through an anonymous drop, everything he suspected crystallized. Embedded deep within the metadata of the Hawthorne's communications archive was a line of code, an operational signature identical to the one used by Meridian's automated system, but time-stamped weeks after the ship had sunk. That meant the system hadn't died. It had relocated. Someone had rebuilt it. Reeves tried to trace the signal, hopping through proxies and dead servers until he finally landed on a facility in coastal Virginia listed as a naval simulation center. It was active, well-funded, and hidden under a new name, Horizon Defense Initiative. On its board sat several of the same executives who once managed Meridian systems. When Reeves tried to push the story to the media, his source inside the network went silent, his apartment ransacked, his hard drives wiped clean. Within a week, Reeves vanished, his vehicle found abandoned at a rest stop outside Wilmington. The case was briefly investigated and then quietly shelved. Claire never stopped searching. She visited the site of the Hawthorne wreck each year, placing a single white rose into the ocean, her only ritual of closure. But on the 12th anniversary, something changed. A Navy drone, performing routine survey mapping of the seabed, captured a signal ping, faint, rhythmic, artificial. The frequency matched the Hawthorne's last known distress beacon, one that should have been dead long ago. The pattern repeated 3 times before fading into silence. When the data reached analysts, most dismissed it as interference, but Claire knew better. The coordinates aligned precisely with the same sector where the Kestrel had last been seen before disappearing. For her, it wasn't proof of survival, it was proof of design, a message, maybe even a warning. If Grady had built something that could outlive him, something that could hide beneath the sea and still respond, then perhaps the truth wasn't buried at all, merely waiting. Even after all these years, the story of the USS Hawthorne refuses to sink. The Navy closed the case, the world moved on, but the questions never stopped. Why did a trusted officer destroy his own ship? Was Ellis Grady truly acting alone, or was he silencing something bigger? And if the system he built survived, where is it now? The ocean keeps its secrets, but sometimes it sends echoes back to those still listening. Claire still visits the pier each year, staring at the same horizon, still waiting for answers that never come. What do you think really happened to the Hawthorne? Was it a cover-up, or something even darker beneath the surface? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more gripping investigations like this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. More mysteries await on Last Clue.